Wait, I saw in their last newsletter. So before I get rolling, the topic today is alternate Molly Pitchers, when I'll present the concept to you, and then we'll look at some individuals that are vying for that crown. 25 years ago, when I started serious research on Molly, I was a little annoyed, I guess, and frustrated. There's so much stories out there, some contradictory, and some have not much basis in fact. So what I decided to do, 25 years ago now, is to put it all together. And I used my training. I have a PhD from Princeton in ancient history on source criticism. And what I did was to collect all the bits of evidence, both artistic and literary, about Molly Pitcher, put them in chronological order, analyze what each piece of information is saying, and try and relate it to everybody else. And when you do that, you can see how the legend grew over time, to a point that items that couldn't have happened are included in the legend, such as she gave birth on the battlefield. Boy, that's dramatic, but didn't happen. That her husband was killed here, according to some versions of the story, yet their son was born 3 years later, so I say that's the longest pregnancy on record. And the French officers collected money and gave her that at the battlefield. George Washington commissioned her a sergeant or captain on the battlefield. They're just different layers to the story that you can actually see how they accreted by putting the sources in chronological order. So I put that all together in what's called a Molly Pitcher Sourcebook. And did you lose your bone? Your bone is over there. Go get your bone. Excuse me. Doggy. Look. Here's your bone. I'll give you another one to finish that one. Okay. So what I did was to put all the sources in order and analyze them. And not to be immodest, this is the only serious hardback book I have seen about Molly Pitcher. I've seen booklets, I've seen versions, and strange versions, but there hasn't been a lot of information new in the last 25 years since I published this. So there are copies available in the local gift shop, and I'll be glad to sign them if you're interested. Spurred into an interest on that topic. So what I want to do is start with a quote from the 1820s. Now we're talking the battlefield, the Battle of 1778. This is from New Jersey State Gazette in 1837. There are earlier versions of this around, and in those days newspapers were freely copied from each other, much as the Associated Press would spread stories today and people give them the byline to the newspaper. So this is from the New Jersey State Gazette in 1837. Molly Pitcher, for the benefit of that class of full-grown children and embryo parents who talk much more of New Jersey chivalry about election times than they ever learned, or are likely to learn from history, it may be proper to add what every New Jersey boy, I should say child, should know, that at the commencement of the Battle of Monmouth, this intrepid woman contributed her aid by constantly carrying water from a spring to the battery, where her husband was employed as a cannoneer in loading and firing a gun, meaning cannon. At length he was shot dead in her presence, just as she was leaving the spring, whereupon she flew to the spot, found her husband lifeless, and at that moment heard an officer who rode up order the gun off, quote, for want of a man sufficiently dauntless to supply his place. Indignant at this order and stung by the remark, she promptly opposed it and demanded the post of her slain husband to avenge his death, flew to the gun, and to the admiration and astonishment of all who saw her, assumed and ably discharged the duties of the vacated post of cannoneer to the end of the battle. For this sterling demonstration of genuine Whig, meaning colonial or patriotic spirit, General Washington gave her a lieutenant's commission upon the spot, which Congress afterwards ratified, and granted her a sword and an epaulet and half pay as a lieutenant for life. She wore the epaulet, received the pay, and was called Captain Molly. This is what I call the developed myth, the developed legend, which is all there in the 1820s, in the generation after the war, when there's still a few people around who fought in the war. But afterwards. Okay, the key elements are carrying water, dead husband, firing a gun, Washington's commission, and a grant from Congress, and being called Captain Molly. Now, there's elements of even that story that I can figure out where they came from, but I'm just saying the legend was there as of the 1820s and earlier, and John Fabiano here shared some of the earlier newspaper sources that showed up on it. So, the question is this a real person or not? And by the way, I just want to get this out there. I smile every time I see the name Molly Pitcher, because that's probably not her name. Molly is a nickname commonly for Mary, and if she was carrying, anybody was carrying a pitcher, ceramic pitcher on the battlefield, it get broke within an hour. Plus it wouldn't hold much water. So we're better off, and I should have labeled the talk, to call her Mary Bucket, because she would have had the water in these heavy camp buckets, and you'd either drag one along with you, or you have a yoke across and you have two of them. So Molly Pitcher is the name, which makes it harder to track. Although some sources I've looked at really claimed one of her last name was really Pitcher. Now, I've never known anybody named Pitcher. There's pitchers in baseball, but they don't have the last name Pitcher. And the Molly is clearly a nickname, and that makes it harder to trace. But it is harder to trace the history of any working class woman from the 1700s. Now, Mary Custis, General Washington's wife, you can trace. She's rich, owned property, married, had kids. But if you're a poor working class woman who's illiterate, as most of the stories will say of Molly Pitcher, it's very hard to trace them unless they got married or had kids that survived. Because in those days, even ordinary male poor people, you don't have a lot of records, although they can vote and serve in the army, so you'd end up with a few more records than you would with a working class woman. So Mary Bucket, not Molly Pitcher, and there used to be in the old office, a sketch from school group came through on a tour and gave us a picture of Molly Fisher at her cannon. Now, looking at this intellectually, you stop there, Molly. That's probably a good place to be stopped while you go to sleep. Option one, is the whole dang thing made up? Okay. Kind of like, I'm trying to think, Peter Pan, or some of these legends. But I don't know enough about history to see if Peter Pan or Snow White actually may have a source somewhere. I haven't studied them enough. But they're so, I say, artificial or fiction that the story could have been made up. I can't buy this option one that Molly Pitcher is totally made up. There's just too much evidence around of stories with a common vein to them. But that is an intellectual option. There was never anybody named Molly Pitcher, and the whole thing got made up by somebody, although there's no way they claim to have done it. Option two, a little more likely, could it be the story of Molly Pitcher, a conglomeration of stories about camp followers? Now, camp followers, or what they called women of the army, are a legitimate aspect of colonial military. They do more than just provide sexual favors. Those are the ones that follow the British Army. But they follow the army, and they will cook, wash, nurse, be with their husbands or boyfriends, be with the army. We know that camp followers were a legitimate part of the army. They received half pay and food rations from the army, although there was a limit how many there could be. My friend John Reese from Pennsylvania did a study of them. The number of women in the army varies on the date and the state, but they are there. And we have evidence of them doing cooking and taking care of the wounded and whatnot. They are part of the army. And I might digress to say one thing the British didn't realize. They thought by European standards that they would win the war by capturing our major cities. Now, unfortunately, America was so big, many times the size of England, that they weren't able to capture the major cities and end the war. Also, they didn't have enough men or soldiers to hold more than 2 major cities at a time. New York and Boston, New York and Philadelphia, New York and Charleston. The country was just too big. What they should have done and didn't done was destroy Washington's army. And I've read some good books on that the army was the war. If Washington and his army were destroyed, that probably would have been the end of the war. What kept the army going? The women that were with it that helped do some of the tasks that I just mentioned, and to keep their husbands happy. Not so much that, for personal reasons, but just that you know your loved one is with you. And the army was a moving city. The British never realized that, but the women were an important part of that. And I give a whole lecture, a separate one on women in the war, but won't get into all of that right now. But is this made up of stories of camp followers? There were indeed camp followers, and I liken this to the story of Paul Bunyan as I understand it. Now, there may be studies that Paul Bunyan, the lumberjack out in the Midwest, was based on an actual person. That may have happened. I'll talk in a moment about Johnny Appleseed. But what my understanding of Paul Bunyan, from having watched it on Walt Disney on TV when I was a youngster, is that they're all the lumberjack stories rolled up together. And Paul Bunyan never had a big blue ox named Babe. He never outraced a train. He couldn't chop down 40 acres in 2 minutes. They're just stories lumberjacks told around the campfires that all coalesced around a figure called Paul Bunyan. That is an intellectual possibility, that our Molly Pitcher was not a real person, but is a collection of stories based on women in the army that we knew existed and being at a certain site or battle. If that is the option, you would think they would mention more than one battle, because Paul Bunyan did a lot of different things, not just in one place, not just at one time. So even though that is an intellectual option, that Molly Pitcher, a woman shooting a cannon at a battle, could be a generic story, it is only associated with Monmouth. And maybe one other spot that we'll look at in just a second. So it gets a little too specific to go with that. So the next option is, could it be based on a real person? And that's where it gets interesting. That's why I label the lecture Alternate Molly Pitchers. Who are some of the people that this may have been? Now, this is based on the premise of Johnny Appleseed. Now, Johnny Appleseed, I also saw on Walt Disney when I was a kid, supposedly wandered around the Midwest planting apple trees for people because he was a nice guy. No, this was a professional horticulturalist that made his money when people started farms, and every farm, even the ones here on the Monmouth battlefield, had an apple orchard, not just to make apple pies, not just to have fresh apples to take to your teacher, but to make apple cider, applejack. Okay, and some people even did it as a cash crop, but it's part of what you grow on your farm to get through the winter. And Johnny Appleseed is a real person. His name was John Chapman. He got the first name right in the legend, but he lost the last name to what he did, Appleseed. He lived from 1774 to 1845, and you can trace his history. Johnny Appleseed is a real person, different name. You see where I'm going. Molly Pitcher could be a real person, it's just remembered as a different name. Now, example one. I want to look at a woman named Margaret Corbin. Margaret is also a Molly. Margaret Corbin, C-O-R-B-I-N, candidate one for a real Molly Pitcher base. Born in 1751, married 1772, so at the time of the battle she was 27. Her husband, John Corbin, served in the 1st Pennsylvania Continental Artillery, and she went with him off to war because women in the Army were permitted to do so. And I might mention what would women in the Army do special with a cannon unit? Well, they could cook for them, do the laundry, and take the wounded off the field during battle. That puts them on the battlefield. Okay. When they're taking care of the wounded, they might also be bringing up water because soldiers get thirsty during the battle. But more importantly, with cannons, you can't fire a cannon without water. Why? Because the cannon barrel gets really hot when it shoots. And if you load the next round into the cannon, when it's still hot, it's going to blow up in your face. So what they do is, we don't have one over there, but they have a ramrod with a sponge on the end. You drop the sponge in the water and you run it down the barrel to cool it down and leave some water in there. So when you load it next time, it doesn't blow up in your face. Water is very important to artillerymen, firstly, because they get thirsty, and second, the cannon needs cooling. Now, who are you going to have carry the water? Somebody's got to go get it. The best guy in your unit, or one of the lesser people in the unit? Well, one of the lesser people, because you don't need him to shoot the cannon. Okay? Could easily that job fall upon a woman, because they're there to take the wounded off anyway. Okay? Or they're there with, remember, cannons don't pull themselves around. Cannons are pulled by something called a caisson. Caisson has the reserve ammunition and the horses. Usually park the caisson about 50 to 100 yards behind the cannon. And then when you need, there's one special guy in the gun crew, and there's about 15 guys in the gun crew. The job is to go get the next couple rounds of shot from the caisson and bring it up. So if there are women with the unit, they're probably going to be back there with the caissons, not up front actually shooting cannons from the start of the battle. So anyway, this is a story that's documented. Margaret Corbin at the Battle of Fort Washington in New York, November 16th, 1776. Washington tried to hold on to New York, like he didn't have enough men. He put a big fort up at Fort Washington, and up at Fort Lee, which is named after General Charles Lee. Important in this battle, I won't be mentioning much today. He was convinced by his head generals that they ought to hold on to Fort Washington when he abandoned New York, and he listened to them, and that was real dumb, because we lost about 40 cannons and a lot of men and a couple generals at the Battle of Fort Washington. During the Battle of Fort Washington, her husband got killed at the cannon. She then helped fire the cannon as a matros, which is somebody who's holding the equipment, not the actual, it's usually the officer that touches the fuse that makes the cannon go bang. This sounds like Molly Pitcher. Similar name, Margaret Molly. Husband's killed, and she's helping to fire a cannon. But during the course of the battle, she was wounded in the breast by a grape shot. She was a casualty at the battle. Okay, the Molly Pitcher as developed, or the story that I read you at the beginning of the talk, didn't say anything about Molly herself. Anything happened to her, except maybe giving birth, which doesn't make any sense. She was severely wounded by grape shot, and her left arm almost got torn off. She was moved to a hospital in Philadelphia and assigned to the Invalid Corps, which is like the reserves. They would be used to guard depots and prisoners and things like that, even though she was a woman. And on July 6, 1779, Congress voted her half pay for life and a complete set of new clothes. Okay. Congress recognized her that she did something brave. And she was mustered out of the Army in 1783, settled in Westchester, New York, where she's known as Captain Molly. Now remember from the story that I read you first, from the 1820s New Jersey newspaper, that said that Molly Pitcher was known thereafter as Captain Molly. Okay, so there's some elements maybe of Margaret Corbin got involved there, and I'll maybe show you why. When she lived in upstate New York, near West Point, besides being known as Captain Molly, she's known as, are there any minors in here? Dirty Kate. Impoverished, poor, hard drinking, died at age 48 in 1800 of a syphilitic disease. Oh, this can't be our Molly Pitcher. Okay, similar story. Okay, Molly, cannon, husband killed, Captain Molly, but it doesn't mention Monmouth at all. It mentions Fort Washington. Her body was moved to West Point in 1926. Now, the problem is, and there's two major issues of trying to screen through the, I won't say garbage, the smoke that's good enough for, to talk about Molly Pitcher. Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. Now, how many have seen the play or the movie Hamilton? Half of you? Some of you? I haven't yet. Is it in movie form yet? I don't care for rap. Although my friend is asking me, why don't you write a play about Molly Pitcher? Ooh, that would be cool. So I'll have to talk to the guy that wrote wrote Hamilton, see what we can do. But Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton is Alexander Hamilton's widow after he died in the duel of Weehawken in 1804. In the early 1800s, a fellow historian named Benjamin Lossing, Lossing, he did a really neat history of the Civil War. He did one of the Revolution, I think 1812 also. He would go to the sites, sketch the important farms and scenery, landscapes, drew sketches of the different generals, and published them, okay? And he was doing his book on the Revolution, and was interviewing Mrs. Hamilton about what Alexander was all about. And the topic of Molly Pitcher came up, and she told Benjamin Lossing, this is Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, Hamilton's widow, yeah, I knew Molly Pitcher, and described Margaret Corbin, Captain Molly. Captain Molly then appeared as the hero of Monmouth in Lossing's book, and is the first contamination of the story. So I threw out for you then as candidate 1, who's Molly Pitcher, if it was a real person. And there's elements of the Molly Pitcher story in the Margaret Corbin story, but they don't jive enough to meet Monmouth, mainly because it never mentions Monmouth. Okay. So candidate 1, we'll leave by the wayside. The story could be based on someone else. And what I want to share with you is the best eyewitness that we have. Now, unfortunately, there's no woman after the battle writing history. I was Molly Pitcher at Monmouth. Although we'll look into that more. Okay, this is a narrative, and it's the first item in the source book by a fellow named Joseph Plum Martin, no relation to me, unfortunately, of the 8th Connecticut Regiment. He wrote up his diaries into a little book that got published around that time, 1830. One version is called Private Yankee Doodle. I think it's the best account by a private soldier in the war. And we have it for sale in the gift shop because he was here at Monmouth, and he tells us personally what happened at several different episodes during the course of Monmouth as an important primary source. Okay, this is what he wrote. One little incident happened during the heat of the candidate at Monmouth, which I was an eyewitness to, and which I would be unpardonable not to mention. Now, we know where he was stationed, and next week we'll go look there at the base of Prying Hill, and we know what maneuvers he did. And he was in an infantry unit that was supporting the cannons, actually in front of the cannons because they were farther up the hill. A woman whose husband belonged to the artillery and was then attached to a piece in the engagement, attended with her husband at the piece the whole time. Okay, so he's saying that Molly Pitcher is part of the cannon, this woman, does not mention the name Molly Pitcher, I take that back. While in the act of reaching a cartridge and having one of her feet as far before her as she could step, a cannon shot from the enemy passed between her legs. Ooh. Without doing any damage other than carrying away the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed that it was lucky it didn't pass a little bit higher. In that case, it would have carried away something more important. Now, this is a bit of a ribald story. It may be, I haven't seen different versions of it, though I have heard that it's a common campfire story. But what's odd is it's talking about a woman at a cannon. Notice he doesn't mention the name of the woman. He didn't know. He's from a different unit. Not even where that cannon was, other than we can maybe figure out if he's at the base of the hill, it's one of the 10 or 12 American cannons at the top of the hill. So that's a bit of primary evidence to work with. And unfortunately, there's nothing that nails anything down. But Joseph Plum Martin saw a woman at a cannon at Monmouth. We know what time, we know about where. Who could that have been? Okay, case study number 2. And John, if I speak out of turn on any of this, let me know. This is research I got from my friend John Fabiano there. Mary Hannah of Allentown. This is an anecdote or a story told by a local historian named Sarah Smith Stafford, who lived in Allentown in the mid-1800s. And this is passage 3 in my source book. Okay, 3A, page 37. It's nice to be able to quote yourself. I just gotta remember where stuff is. She's writing in 1876. Molly Pitcher was a daughter of John Hannah of Allentown. He was an Irish Presbyterian and had another daughter named Betty, who married Hugh Ager, if I pronounce it right. Ager was a servant of Samuel Rogers, who was reputed to be of noble descent, and Betty was brought up by him. Molly lived as a servant with Mr. Bruer, how do you pronounce that?
Bruer.
Bruer, thank you. The father of Captain Bruer of the Monmouth militia. Her father, her father and Ager were said to have been Irish redemptionists, and that is, they were sold for a time to pay for their passage, kind of like indentured servants. The name Pitcher was a nickname, given to her by soldiers because she often carried a huge pitcher around to water them. Some said she also followed soldiers as the wife of a John Maban. Okay, so this mentions Molly Pitcher by name. It's 100 years after the battle, but she says she has sources on it, and in the book, again with the help of my friend John there, I spend several pages analyzing the account and related accounts that bring up this Mary Hannah as a possible Molly Pitcher candidate. It's the first and of the few claiming she's actually from New Jersey. As you know, the troops in the Army had troops were from all over the place. The story was picked up in 1876 in the Monmouth Inquirer and other newspapers, and I have a version of that to share with you. An article from the Monmouth Inquirer, March 16th, 1876. Molly Pitcher, who was she? Ooh. So her history before and after the Battle of Monmouth. She was a daughter of John Hannah of Allentown, Irish Presbyterian. Had a daughter named Betty. Talked about Ager, the servant of Rogers. Lived as a servant with Bruer of the Monmouth militia, pretty much copying what Miss Stafford had said. Miss Stafford is 75 years old, well known for her accounts of history. After the war, Molly followed the soldiers off. She died at Fort Montgomery up in the Hudson Highlands. That's Margaret Corbin. It's getting the stories conflated. Those who knew her there called her stout, red-haired, freckle-faced Irish woman with piercing eyes. Her life as a camp follower with honorary husbands soon lowered her reputation. She was known as Dirty Kate, and she died of syphilis. Okay, that's confusing the Margaret Corbin story. So we can erase that off, and you still have the Mary Hannah, who is said by a local historian to have been the Molly Pitcher at the battle. It's nothing that the person themselves was claiming, but it is a legitimate contender, this Mary Hannah. Part of looking all that up, some claim that, well, okay, we'll talk about that, about where she's born, we'll talk about that later. So anyway, that's case 2. And John, if you want to comment when I'm done about additional research you've done on that. But this brings us to the usual identification of the Molly Pitcher at the battle as someone named Mary Hayes Macaulay. Now, you ask where the Macaulay came from. There was a woman up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, after the war that had some interesting evidence we'll look at. She was married to a William Hayes, who can be shown to have been in an artillery unit, the 4th Pennsylvania, that was here at the battle. He died, and she married a guy named Macaulay, and he died, and that's why she's known as Mary Hayes Macaulay with different spellings. Now, this is to build, again, we're trying to build on who possibly historically Molly Pitcher could have been. And when she lived, Mary Hayes Macaulay, up in Carlisle. There's some quotes by her neighbors that are quite interesting. Miss Harriet, this is from 1896. I mean, this is 100 years after the battle. These are people that lived next door to her in their old age, recalling things. Miss Harriet Folk, in 1896, her father was a doctor. Her description of Molly says that she had a defective eye. I kid my friend Stacy Roth, who does an really good program on Molly Pitcher that she will do here at the battle. We do it in the standing room only. If you want to come see her, come down to the reenactment and come early to get a seat. I kid Stacy because she's a bit on the thin side. And all the stories we've got here seem that Molly was short, dumpy, got an eye disease during the war, could only see from one eye, and had bristly hair growing out of her nose. I say, no, Stacy, you're not totally in costume right, but you got the right idea. She did various kinds of housework for a number of years. She was homely in appearance, not refined in manner or of language, but ready to be nice to anyone. She was average height, muscular, strong, heavy-set, a busy talker. She wore a short gown, white or calico, linsey striped shirt, and a broad white cap. Further, she was well known to the neighbors as Molly Pitcher of Monmouth. And no effort seems to have been made to separate that fact from the woman. So that's one of her neighbors. I'll just say, and one more, and there are others that are like it. This is from Elizabeth D. Huff, 1908. My God, getting up there. Molly Pitcher was the name history is given to Mary Hayes Macaulay, the heroine of the Battle of Monmouth, who was serving water to the embattled soldiers. She swore a deposition that I lived right across the street from where Molly died. She was low, short, stout, heavily built woman, wore a petticoat and a short gown. She did not wear dresses at the time. There was something the matter with one of her eyes. I can't remember what. She wore a white cap. Her hair was as white as the cap. She was at our house all the time. She was rough and uncouth in her expressions, could tell of the battle. I remember my mother telling her, Molly, I won't have that kind of talker swearing around my children. Poor old Molly. She would tell of the battlefield and how she used to carry water to the soldiers. She used to tell a lot of things that happened in battle. I can't remember all of what she said. She said that when her first husband was killed, that's the wrong part of the story, I remember telling her, you should have been at Monmouth and learned how to shoot a cannon. Okay, there are other accounts like this from young ladies in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, who saw a woman whom they understood to be, not that she was claiming to be, whom they understood to be the Molly Pitcher at the battle. But it still doesn't tell us who it was. It just gives, if this is to accept that her husband's name was Hayes, who was the Hayes guy. Maybe we'd identify him, then we'd work backwards and figure out who she was. Now, I apologize, this is all convoluted in stories, but it is winding up to a conclusion. But there is no smoking gun, as much as I have studied this. But the evidence seems to be building together, not in a case that 2 + 2 = 4, this is Molly Pitcher, but 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 = 10, and there's enough evidence together that may be able to prove that. Who could she have been? Now, this is lemon number 2. Lemon number 1 was Margaret Corbin. A woman fought in a battle, her husband was killed, she was wounded, but the rest of it doesn't mention Monmouth. Okay, this one drives me nuts. Reverend C.P. Wing, never met him, don't want to, wrote in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography in 1878 that he had succeeded in identifying Molly Pitcher as a woman named Mary Ludwig Hayes. Okay, this is the Ludwig theory. Okay. Now, what he wrote, and unfortunately, he has no footnotes, but this is what he wrote. I worked on the identification of Mrs. Hayes, and this is what I found. The original name before marriage was Mary Ludwig, so recorded in the family Bible. This family Bible is nowhere to be seen, but this is his evidence. She herself probably came from Germany. Ludwig, or Ludwig, is a German name. We first discover her at Trenton, New Jersey. Okay, nice New Jersey connection, where she had quarters with General Irvine. Her husband was John Hayes, a barber, a sergeant in the artillery. He was an Irishman, not an Englishman. He was in the Battle of Monmouth and is said to have, at least for a time, been directing a cannon. When he was struck down, not killed, she was coming on the ground with a pitcher of water, not a bucket, It was a very hot day, and the soldiers suffered much from heat and thirst. Her husband was borne from the ground. She instantly took his place by the gun, and some say she shot several rounds. Others say she only loaded and fired once. Instead of continuing at the post, was induced to retire. At this point, she was seen by General Washington. We only know that he was informed of her conduct, gave her a commission as a sergeant, and lived out her life afterwards. So, this account by Reverend Wing identifies Molly Pitcher as a woman named Mary Ludwig. Now, what's interesting is he traced this all down. Mary Ludwig and John Hayes were married outside of Philadelphia. We know all about the family, and that's cool, except John Hayes wasn't in the artillery and wasn't at Monmouth. And this was adequately proved by Sam Smith in the 1970s. Now, it's probably a little before the time for you guys, but in the 1970s, Sam Smith, in this booklet of Molly Pitcher Chronology, available in the gift shop, goes through the Ludwig stories and successfully identifies that the Hayes that the person on the battle was with and lived in Carlisle afterward was named William, not John. And I tried to go through some of that research also. There was a family Bible mentioned by Reverend Wing, can't find it. There's supposed to be a birth certificate at the Presbyterian Church in Lawrenceville, then known as Maidenhead. I looked for this birth certificate, and the problem is in the mid-1700s, because I went through the seminary, Princeton Seminary, there, Presbyterian, that it was an itinerant preacher. They didn't work out of one church. They traveled all the time. And Lord knows where any records went, but they aren't there preserved in the New Jersey records of that church at the Princeton Seminary. So I couldn't prove those stories, but trust me, I tried. But Sam Smith looked at it some more and said that he can show that William Hayes was the husband. Now, I looked into this William Hayes, and so did Sam Smith. We know he was in Proctor's 4th Pennsylvania Artillery. We know that because we have his enlistment records. He was a barber from near New Hope in Pennsylvania. And we have his enlistment papers. And we know how long he served and what he got paid and where he was. Now, a lot of this battery was left in Philadelphia at the time of the Monmouth campaign, but part of it shows up on the battlefield. And I studied that in the book. I have a whole chapter on the 4th Pennsylvania Artillery in my book, that there were men from this unit at the battle. And I think what they did was maybe attach them with another unit, or they brought part of the battery and left the other. Usually cannons or batteries then only had 2 cannons in them anyway. And the crews would be around 30, 40 men, not real big. Now, this gets interesting that William Hayes, who was married to a woman named Mary, and we have the marriage certificate from up in Carlisle, was in a battery that was here at the battle. I know the name of it, 4th Pennsylvania Artillery, commanded by an officer named Proctor. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, and I had done, this is one of the 2 items of original research I'm throwing in. During the course of the battle, there was a Dr. Reed who came up from Georgia to join the Army. Now, he didn't really want to come up to be a doctor. He wanted to come up to get a commission as an officer. Believe it or not, he reached the battlefield at the time of the battle, reached the Army at the time of the battle. And as he's crossing the battlefield looking for General Washington, what's interesting is he ran across a Pennsylvania officer, doctor, that he knew who had just been wounded. And what's interesting is I can trace Dr. Reed's movements across the battlefield hour by hour. And this officer that he saw wounded helps me date another part of the battle time-wise, if he saw him just be wounded. And it's tied into when Aaron Burr, who was wounded, who was here, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, he ends up on Perrine Hill, which is where we'll go next week. And when he's on Perrine Hill, he tells the story that Washington is there on his horse with his, what I call his spy glasses, looking at the battle. And while he's looking at the battle, a cannonball lands nearby. Fortunately, he hit the mud, not him or his horse. Spattered mud all over the place. And his staff officers say, sir, maybe you ought to move, the enemy has your range. Now, if any of you have been on tours with me, I will let you know that if you're in the army fighting in a Revolution battle, shoot the guys on the horses. They're either the officers or the staff officers, but they're important people because they're on horses. So Washington's there on his horse, British cannons had the range, they shot at him, they just missed. I cringe to think what would have happened if Washington had been killed at the Battle of Monmouth. He had a better chance of getting killed at Princeton, where when the lines were lined up facing each other, he actually rode in front of the lines to give them an encouragement, and the British raised their muskets, and the British officers, no, don't shoot. Because the British officers felt closer related to American officers than they did to their own troops, socially. Washington could have been killed at Princeton, but he wasn't. And that saved the country for him to be here. Washington did not lose the Battle of Monmouth. He survives to become our first president. And as I talked a couple months ago on General Washington, why is he an ideal candidate to be our first president? He has no sons to set up a dynasty. He's a leader, he's a military guy, he's capable, but he had no sons. There was no danger of him setting up a dynasty. So a lot of important things didn't happen here at Princeton and at Monmouth, and he got killed. Anyway, so the officers say, sir, you should move, they have your range. And he says, no, I am busy seeing how Proctor's artillery is dealing with their right. Now, Washington's on the center of Pine Hill out there, and I'll show you where. And he's looking at a cannon shooting at the British right, which is, well, you can almost see it beyond that house out there. On the hill behind that house, that'll be the cannon on the left end of the American line, with Joseph Plum Martin down in front of it. That's where Proctor's battery was at the battle. Okay. William Hayes was at the battle. He was at Proctor's battery. We know now where it was, based on that testimony of Dr. Reed, which I found in a book of Georgia Revolutionary War recollections, and then pieced it all together. And again, William Hayes is there. They weren't married yet. He wasn't married yet, so it's not her husband, and he didn't get killed, certainly. But William Hayes ends up marrying a woman named Mary. We don't know her last name. We don't know her birth date. We don't know where she was born, because she was a poor American working class woman. But those pieces are coming together. But the purpose of this is to deal with candidate 3. Now, I'm a teacher. I like to repeat things. Okay. I talked about Margaret Corbin. It has similar elements, very similar. Worked a cannon, husband killed, wounded, Captain Molly, but some of the parts don't jive. We talked about Mary Hannah, who is a legitimate candidate. It's just there's not a direct evidence because it's coming from 100 years later. And now we're talking about Mary Ludwig. Now, it drives me nuts that there are still people saying our Molly Pitcher is Mary Ludwig Hayes. I was at the New Jersey Militia Museum in Seagirt last week, and their display on Monmouth talks about Mary Ludwig Hayes. Damn it, they haven't read this, and they certainly haven't read this, that this Ludwig stuff is still around. I don't contest that there was a Mary Ludwig married to a John Hayes down in Philadelphia, but he wasn't in the artillery, he wasn't at Monmouth, and he wasn't named William. Now, I had a big debate with a fellow whose name I have forgotten, thank goodness, who was an actual descendant of Molly Pitcher. And he says, I should know I'm of the bloodline. And is it possible, he asked me, that she was married to a John Hayes and he died and she marries a cousin or brother, William? And I said, anything is possible. You might be my long lost brother. I can't say no. If you mean likely, I would say not likely. But possible, because anything is possible. So he quotes me later that Dr. Martin, the author of the book, says it's possible that she was married to a John Hayes and then married to William. I got quoted out of context. Be careful what you say, I guess, to people on topics near and dear to you. So I get bristly on the back of my neck. That's why I wrote the book, that Mary Ludwig is not Molly Pitcher. We're better off, well, okay, that's got Margaret Corbin problem, thanks to Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, and we got the Mary Ludwig problem. So who is this person that's up in Carlisle? what do we know more about them? She had a son, John, and this is the, I hate to admit it, but I'll have to. Her son's name is John L. Hayes. And the Ludwig people say, yeah, the L is for Ludwig. He served in the War of 1812. I don't know, we just don't know. It's never, he's just cited always as John L. Hayes. Okay, I will throw in my hat and give up the whole topic if they can prove that the son's name was John Ludwig Hayes. I don't think it's going to be, and I would love to find out. And I think it means more delving into the tax and land records up in Carlisle to see, or he was in the Army, I didn't think of that. Search his full, when he enlisted, he might have given his full name. And that would totally disprove, I think, the Ludwig theory. She made her living, as I said, house cleaning. She also cleaned the windows on the courthouse as part of her cleaning trade. Why is that important? Because when her paycheck was signed with X, her mark, which is evidence that she's illiterate. Okay. So how did she get by? Well, she got by because of some pensions. In 1822, which is 40 years after the war, they are still giving out pensions to widows. And she actually had a pension from one of her husbands, and part of the pension was a land grant out in Ohio. Now, what the hell use was her to get a land grant out in Ohio? And the Society of Cincinnati, which is the officers, Cincinnati, Ohio, is named after that. They were giving land grants to veterans out in Ohio. They're short on money, but you get a land grant. What happened was these unscrupulous bankers went around buying up the quitclaim deeds. And she sold some land there to get a little money off it because there's no way she was going to move to Ohio. But what's going on in 1822? And this is pretty much what nails me on the alternate topic. Again, we've looked at Margaret Corbin, we looked at Mary Hannah, we looked at Mary Ludwig, now we're looking at Mary Hayes Macaulay, 4 different real candidates. A bill was introduced in Harrisburg to give her a pension. Now, the pension, this one, was not in the name of one of her husbands, both of whom served in the war. But the pension is listed as for her services in the Revolutionary War. What the heck would this working woman in Carlisle have done to get a pension from the state of Pennsylvania? I have looked and looked in the Pennsylvania records to try and get some of the debate. The bill was sponsored by the local congressman from Carlisle. It passed. She was given a $40 pension a year, or half what a soldier got. What's interesting, and this is what I still get prickly hairs on the back of my neck when I look at it, the index to the public laws of Pennsylvania of 1822 say there was a bill to Mary Macaulay, M-C-K-O-L-L-Y, totally misspelled, but that's her. Relief bill, revolutionary heroine. Somebody who didn't know her is saying she's a revolutionary heroine. Now, what the heck would she have done to be called a heroine and to get a pension from the state of Pennsylvania? There are only 3 women that got pensions. One's Margaret Corbin, we already talked about. One's a woman named Sampson from Virginia who served in the Army as an infantryman. And they didn't find her out till she got wounded, and the doctor went to go work on her in the hospital and say, "You're not a man." And she said, "I know." And anyway, so there are 3 women who got pensions, all of whom we know who they are. But again, the index to the Pennsylvania laws of 1822 says Mary Macaulay, Revolutionary Heroine Relief Bill. And more than that, the fact that she got a pension was reported in newspapers in New York and Washington and Philadelphia. She was not a nobody. And this is the 1820s, the same time as that quote I read you at the beginning, when every New Jersey boy, meaning student, should know the story of Molly Pitcher at the Battle of Monmouth. I think I have a small quote on that, but I think I already quoted it for you. Excuse me a moment while I take it out. 201, number 7. This is from the Washington, D.C. National Intelligencer, March 15, 1822. Molly Macaulay, who received a pension from the state of Pennsylvania for services rendered in her war, was well known to the general officers as a brave and patriotic woman. She was called Sergeant Macaulay. Was wounded at some battle. No, that's Margaret Corbin. Supposedly Brandywine. No, stupid, it's Monmouth. Where her sex was discovered. No, the story's all messed up. Okay, because that's the way oral history works. But nowhere is she called Molly Pitcher. She died in 1832, January 2nd, and was buried there in Carlisle as a poor working class woman who did not even have a grave marker until 1876. This is the obituary in the Carlisle newspaper that I looked up. January 26, 1832, died last Sunday, Mrs. Mary Macaulay, better known as Molly, aged about 90. They didn't even know how old she was. The history of this woman is somewhat remarkable. Her first husband's name was Hayes, who was a soldier in the Revolution. It appears that she continued with him while in the army and acted so much the part of the heroine as to attract the notice of officers. Some estimate may be found of the value of her service rendered by her that she received a pension from the government. No mention of Molly Pitcher, unfortunately. So, what happens then, in summary, and then working to the end of my allotted hour, I'm a school teacher. My attention span is 45 minutes usually, but I tell stories, because that's how long my classes are. This distresses me when I watch the TV shows on TV. If you watch NCIS or something, for 45 minutes, you miss the exciting conclusion because your attention span's gone. What's better is you start watching it 10 or 15 minutes in, because not only do you see the plot get resolved, you also have to figure out what was the crime in the first place. So I try to take appropriate breaks so I can follow the whole story. What have I gone through? Is Molly Pitcher's story totally made up like Peter Pan? No, there's too much evidence of somebody was based on it. Is it a conglomerate of camp follower stories? Could be, but why are they only focused on Monmouth, except for that one newspaper article they had mixed up with Brandywine? Could be, not likely. Is the story based on somebody real? And that's why I bring up again Johnny Appleseed. Real person, mixed up name, but we know the dates and we know what they did. Okay, John Chapman was his name. So Molly Pitcher, probably not the real name, even though I said some people claim her last name was Pitcher. The last name seems to be Hayes, based on a specific incident that happened at this battle. And we can track that one. We track that William Hayes, the husband or the boyfriend / husband. He was here, what unit it was in, when he served. He was where he came from, where they ended up in Carlisle. That helps us at the end of his life. And we know where that woman's buried. We just don't know what her maiden name was, where and when she was born. So you can't nail it all down. But when you look at all the pieces and trace back the original story and glean off George Washington, Battlefield Commission, dead husband, all of this, we still have the common elements of Monmouth, woman, cannon, water. And that's our Molly Pitcher. We don't know who for sure it was, because she didn't leave a written record of it. What makes me sad is that the Margaret Corbin stuff we can glean off pretty understandably. The Mary Ludwig stuff is still out there and doesn't hold water. So to me, it's still an ongoing search. We may never find out who really she was, but there's always a chance you will. And each generation has their new identity, which is why there are 12 different sites on the battlefield claiming to be Molly Pitcher's well. And you can get my book and look at that. Sorry, Molly. At least the original story said she was getting water from a spring and not a well, which seems more likely because every one of the farms here had a well to it. There's a big untapped source of information on the war and even on this battle that hasn't been cited yet are these pension applications. When the government said in the 1820s, you can get a pension or a land grant, you got to prove you were here. And a lot of these older soldiers then would get their officers or their comrades to write accounts supporting them. And those are still out there in the state archives in the different states, mostly New Jersey and Pennsylvania where they are. Relevance of this is I was working in the gift shop 10, 15 years ago. A guy came in and wanted to know where the Essex County Militia was at the battle. I said, I did the Essex County Militia, that's Newark, what are they doing here? He showed me a document from his great-great-grandfather's war service that he was at this battle. And behold, I researched it some more, and it turned out the Essex County Militia was here. But I wouldn't have known it for sure if I hadn't been sparked by this pension record. So the pension records are still out there, or when the soldiers got the land grant and sold it and said who they were and what battles they were in. So there's still a chance that we might get some more information down the line. Just as 20 years ago when I was writing the book, I ran across that account by Dr. Reed, which placed Proctor's artillery at the battle, and things started clicking in. Proctor's artillery, there's a William Hayes in Proctor's artillery. He married afterwards a woman named Mary, they lived in Carlisle, blah, blah, blah. Great, we just, again, don't know who she is. So that's where we are, and the title of the talk was Molly Pitcher, or better known as Mary Bucket, and who some of the candidates might be, and it's still an open book on if she can be identified, and if so, who. Okay, so that'll conclude my talk at exactly 1 hour. I'll be glad to field questions or comments. Maybe John, if you want to say anything more about Mary Hannah.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to invite everyone, if they're still interested in this subject, to I'm scheduled to present a program on Mary Hannah and another woman by the name of Ginny Jackson. Both of them happen to be from Allentown, New Jersey, and they're both from that same source, the Sarah Stafford source. Problem is that she's really not reliable. Her father, interestingly enough, was a bona fide hero, but she claimed he rescued the flag that flew on the Bonhoeffer Shard that fell into the North Sea, and that he was a hero and had traveled with John Paul Jones. In reality, though, he was with John Barry, and he took a letter to the Tower of London from the Continental Congress, because to Henry Lawrence, who had been captured, who was former head of the Congress, and he had been captured and put into prison there, and he delivered this letter and it returned. So her father had all this memory. Problem is, as she got older, she started to mix up these individuals. Now, I'm going to give a talk on Mary Hannah and on Ginny Jackson, and recently I've been doing more research on the Battle of Monmouth, in particular the British March to Monmouth. I do have a YouTube video out there, Washington Crossing Roundtable Group, regarding the British March, which I did last June. In that, the concern was exactly how Lafayette had gotten to the battle. Long story short, my research is now that this other woman, Ginny Jackson, who again supposedly had shown Washington to the Battle of Princeton, more likely had shown Lafayette or Hamilton to the Battle of Monmouth. So if you're interested in this subject, and I'll do a program, I'm scheduled to give a program at Millstone, April 26th, which is Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock. And I'll be able to inform you there.
Okay, thank you, John. Thank you for your research and sharing it with me. Okay, any questions or comments you have? Yes.
Which one is buried out in Reading, Pennsylvania? Kind of like a little monument to her.
Carlisle.
It's in Carlisle.
Sorry?
The Mary Hayes Macaulay, the most likely candidate, but not the definite, is buried in Carlisle. What's interesting, and when she passed in 1832, the family couldn't afford a marker. In 1876, they put a marker up, and then the Artillery Association put another marker up, and somebody else put a marker up calling her Mary Ledwig. I think there's 3 markers there now. It's in the town cemetery in Carlisle. Every once in a while when I drive by, I take the Carlisle exit and go see her. Unfortunately, the house she lived in got torn down. Right. Yes, Jen?
Yeah, the Burlington County history actually says that Mary Hannah is the woman buried in Carlisle. So that's how it got so
things get conflated, and you can see why. It's oral history. And oral history will take common elements, like with Paul Bunyan, and mix them together, and some are fantastic, and some are just confused with somebody else. And what I'm trying to show is how Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton mixed up Mary Corbin with our Molly, and how Reverend Wing, who I assume meant well, mixed her up with Mary Ludwig from Philadelphia, but that could be disproved. It just annoys me that people haven't picked up on current research, and that, especially the Ludwig stuff. Okay, so any other questions? I'll be glad to talk to individuals afterwards. Okay, thank you for coming out. See you next month.